Welcome to the LSI Behind the Wind podcast. My name is Sean Slatter, and for 30 years, I've dedicated my life to the science of business development. I've seen the impact of our work, which has evolved into economic development and now social impact. In this episode, I'm so excited to have one of my longtime mentors and someone who I really admire, Dr. Burleigh Brunson. Dr. Brunson is really one of the founders of business development process and is responsible for a lot of Lockheed Martin's growth over the last 25 years, 30 years. He put together a business development process that Lockheed still uses today. We worked for Dr. Brunson as one of his partners while he led business development at Lockheed Martin. He subsequently came to work for LSI and helped us build strategy, and a lot of the work that Dr. Brunson did as he transitioned into his role with LSI, we still use today. A lot of the strategy that he had put together, a lot of his process, tools, and templates, we still use today. And this was so fun catching up with Dr. Brunson, having worked with him for all of these years and having him explain his background and his work with Lockheed and LSI. I hope you enjoy this episode. If you have a need for any capture, proposal development, program execution, strategy, please reach out to our team. We would love to provide that support to your organization. Enjoy this episode with Dr. Burleigh Brunson. Burleigh, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to see you dressed up.
I've had client meetings all morning, and they're going to go into tonight. So I am so excited to see you, and have been looking forward to this. And I feel horrible that we're not together in DC. I've never seen this before. They canceled my flight 48 hours in advance, and just in anticipation of this snowstorm. And then they told me I could get in there late today, and I just said, no, that's not going to work. So I'll let you know when I'm in town next, and to get together with you and catch up.
Sure, I'd look forward to that. Yeah, but my granddaughter, was talking to her yesterday. She had a friend that they just came off school break yesterday. It was their first day of school in like almost a month. And but one of her friends went to Rome with her family. They're stuck in Rome. They can't get home.
Oh my goodness.
That's a tough place to be stuck. But
then I heard this morning that there are several airlines canceling flights over this 5G issue as well, just anticipating it. So I feel bad I'm not there, but I think it would have been difficult to get out of DC.
Well, or get in or out. Either way, yeah. Yeah, I was back early last year. My sister was very ill. She lives in Oklahoma, and as she eventually passed away, unfortunately. But I made 3 trips during this COVID thing. 3 trips to Oklahoma City. And I had to go through Denver, and Houston and Denver, and you get into Houston and they go, well, I'm not sure the plane that's going to take you to Oklahoma City is going to get here because, there's, and you know what I think? I mean, some of it's true, but I think they're using they're using this as excuses.
They are. That's right.
A lot. And so it gives them a freedom to, cancel things. If there aren't 100 people on the airplane, oh, well, dear, you can catch the next one, right?
Yeah, that's you're exactly right. We went to Canada over the holiday, and it was horrible. And they just said, we don't have staff. Everybody is either sick or they're afraid of getting sick. And so they're not staffing baggage handling or the ticket counters don't have staff. It was tough.
Yeah.
Well, you look fantastic, and you've not changed one bit. And I think retirement must be agreeing with you.
It is. I retired at the end of 15. So I've been retired now for, good grief, 6 years now. but that doesn't mean I've been very busy. You know me. I'll tell you about it in a minute when you ask me the question. But
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for doing this. As I had said in my email, I admire you so much, and you're really I consider you to be one of the founding fathers of this business development methodology and process. And a lot of our clients have asked us to put together these podcasts, and our team as well. It's been a great way for us to bring together our team. So you've got such a history, and I've got so many questions for you. I look forward to it. Let's get started. Maybe just start by talking about some of your background and your time at the Naval Academy, which I think's a great place to start.
Well, as you know, I'm a retired scientist, business executive, and I spent the last 50 plus years. I'm 76 years old, which is frightening, but I spent the last 50 years kind of doing things I call them decadal increments. Every 10 years, I do something, right? And so my first 10 years or so after I became an adult was sort of getting my academic background together, my educational credentials. So I have a bachelor's degree in oceanography and engineering from the Naval Academy. I was the first class ever to get a degree in a particular subject, interestingly enough. I was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to South America. So I spent my first year after graduation in Ecuador, which was tough duty. And I have a master's doctorate degree in physical oceanography from Oregon State University. And then as I transitioned from from a scientist to a business executive or leader, I figured I didn't know how to do a balance sheet. So I went back to school again and got an MBA. So I have an MBA from George Washington University. So I'm fully credentialed, if you will. Upon leaving, I was injured in flight training. Within like 3 months after I started flight training, I hurt my back in an ejection seat, and I retired. I retired 2.5 years after graduated from the Naval Academy. And so when I left active duty, and that was in 1970, I spent 10 years as a research scientist. I started off getting my master's and PhD degrees, but then I worked as a research scientist in underwater acoustics within the Naval Research Laboratory system, one in San Diego, one at Stennis, Mississippi. And I left that then about 10 years later, and in 1981, and I took a position as a research scientist in a private company up here in Washington. So it was 1981, which is amazing. We came up here to Washington, D.C. area in Virginia, and I was a research scientist in a small company called Planning Systems Incorporated. And while I was there, I was principal scientist when I signed on. But due to some significant changes in that company, I then moved up to become the executive vice president, chief operating officer of that company. And as the leader of the company, our company was recognized by Inc. magazine as one of the 100 fastest growing small businesses in America. I left there. Lockheed at the time was one of our partners, and we were doing a lot of research for them. They then asked me to come to Lockheed, and I did that once again in my 10-year here. So in 1991, I left this small company, and I was appointed as vice president to lead the anti-submarine warfare division at Sanders, which was a Lockheed company. They had bought Sanders at the time. And so I went up there. I was only up there for a year. And then I was asked to come back to Washington and head up the underwater systems division for the corporation. And what we had was an office here in Virginia. And we had one of the first ever highly classified links between the Pentagon and what was essentially the Space Systems Company in California. And I headed up the ASW. What we were trying to do is use satellites for undersea warfare, which hadn't been done up until that time. And so I was there in that time, and I stayed with Lockheed for 20 years, and eventually became Lockheed Martin. Martin and Lockheed merged, and I had several positions in Lockheed, culminating in when you and I were working together as vice president of programs, plans, and analysis, and that was after we had combined all of these companies. And I'll talk to you about it a little bit later about what we did specifically at Lockheed. But I was in that role, I was responsible then for identification and deployment of business development best practices across the corporation. And I did the performance of market and competitive analyses and training and development of the business development professionals across the corporation. And over the course of my 20 years there, the teams that I headed up, we won 3 Lockheed Martin Nova Awards, which is the highest award Lockheed essentially gives for performance of teams. Executives don't get them. Their teams get them, which is just right. And so we got 3 Nova Awards, and then we developed, and that's the part we were talking about, the integrated new business framework. And that's how we unified business development activities across the corporation. And it's really an application of processes. And the result of that, Lockheed then had the highest competitive win rates in aerospace and defense. We were in our focus programs, which were the corporate level, we were 100%. We won every corporate focus program that we went after during that 8 or 9 years that we were doing this. And the biggest one, of course, was when we beat Boeing for F-35, which is huge. Perhaps the largest program in the history of the Department of Defense. And so I retired from Lockheed in January of 2011, as you know, and I then about that same time joined you there at LSI. And I remember you brought me on as your chief strategist because you wanted a long-term strategy for LSI to grow your company. And we worked on that corporate level strategic plan to accelerate growth and position you as a logistics company, which you were, and get recognized as a business development a consulting company. And with that assistance of you and your people, we delivered that plan at the end of 2012. That was at the end of 2011. That was your 2012 strategic plan. And what it had was really an operating plan for the divisions and a long-range strategy plan for LSI. And I left, I think it was like February or something like that of 2012. And Chip Schleider and I formed a small 2-man company, which actually, I talked to Chip yesterday. It still exists.
Oh my goodness.
And so Chip and I formed a company called Defense Contracting Consulting Group. And I was the president, COO, and he was the CEO. So 2 guys, right? So we essentially worked for small to mid-sized companies. And we both insisted non-competitors for Lockheed Martin. Both of us being former executives at Lockheed, we were not going to go help Northrop or Boeing or Raytheon in that. So we worked for companies that did not compete. So we were asked by these companies to develop these business development marketing capabilities for the aerospace and defense competitive sector. I retired from that role at the end of 2015. My last gig was in Ohio at Battelle. Battelle had essentially a defense group, and in 3 months we had to develop their business development process, their 2016 operating plan, and then I had to train them. I did that in 3 months. That was, you talk about, I spent a lot of time in Ohio, and that's why I said I think I'll quit. I'm tired, and so I retired then at the end of 15. But I really retired from work, if you will, for pay, and began doing advisory board work. And so I've been an advisory board member or board member for the dean of the School of Business at George Washington University, the University of Maryland School of Business, the College of Environmental, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. Then I was also just elected as the vice president for Naval Academy Alumni Association, Greater Washington chapter. And we just won a chapter excellence award last year. And right now, I'm currently a member of, it's a new startup called Strategic Technology Transition. And it's an MBA program at George Washington University sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security. And so what we're trying to do there is bring commercial technology into the Department of Homeland Security to help them develop their strategic technologies and obviously to deploy them in the environment we're in. So that's where I am right now. And that's a quick snapshot of 50 years.
That's amazing. Well, I've got a lot of questions, as you can imagine. I really attribute, Burley, the guidance that you gave us with your time at LSI set us on this trajectory of exponential growth. We have just continued to double in size, and a lot of that strategy and guidance that you'd given to me when you had left Lockheed, it's still a central part of our overall strategy, and I was so thankful to have that time working together with you. I also we continue to work with Lockheed Martin, and I attribute the growth of Lockheed to a lot of your work. You just quietly had put together this strategy and this process, and you said it well. This was about the business development team that you enabled and provided the tools necessary for these organizations to identify and win this business.
Mhm.
And so many great programs over the years were won by Lockheed with your guidance and strategy. And so maybe let's talk about that. When you talked about first being part of Sanders, was that in the Nashua? Was that the old Nashua Sanders
Yes,
group? Was
yeah,
that
it
where
was a
you?
Nashua. It was a Lockheed company. They had bought
Mhm.
Nashua, and it became the electronic systems sector of Lockheed. And what happened is when they merged with Lockheed and Martin merged, what we saw was conflict. There was some conflict in the pieces, and we sold Sanders off, and
Right,
so they became part of BAE Systems, which they are
right.
now. They're part of their electronics piece of BAE Systems, primarily air systems, air radars, and those kinds of things. Less so in the undersea warfare business because, as you can imagine, Lockheed in our Manassas business, and when we absorbed the Syracuse piece of GE, became the premier undersea warfare company in that sense. And so the Sanders piece that I headed up was pretty small. It was really high tech. We developed the first laser detector, the ability to detect submarines and or mines using lasers while I was there. And then we also developed what was called the low frequency active, the very low frequency. And this was an array, a vertical array of sonars that essentially was deployed off the ship. It was so loud in the low frequency range that essentially they did not develop it because it was scaring the whales.
Oh my
It was
goodness.
so powerful. It was having environmental impact, and
Oh my
essentially
goodness.
they didn't go further forward with it with the program ultimately in terms of deployment. But what it did, the work we learned at the time was the ability then to bring active and passive sonars using the emerging technology that computers are capable of doing now. So we could do cross correlation of active and passive sonars and detect submarines as they came out. You can imagine what kind of a flag they had on them as they came out of the North Sea into the Atlantic. And then as at that time, we immediately would put a US attack submarine on their tail. And so it was, the end of the Cold War, if you will. And thankfully, it never got hot.
Was Rick Diamond there? He was one of your people, right?
Who was
At
that?
Nashua? Rick Diamond. Did you work with Rick there?
No, I didn't. I
In
didn't.
business development?
No, I didn't
You
work with,
have
with Rick.
you you have so many individuals that you mentored over the years that are now in illustrious positions, even CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and we could talk about a lot of them. But Rick was one of the individuals at Nashua that I really thought highly of and respect. So when you got to Lockheed Corporate and had responsibility for business development, talk about some of the processes that you developed and then implemented throughout the organization that really led to this exponential growth for Lockheed.
Okay.
I learned so much working with you and with a lot of your team that you had trained over the years. But to talk about that business development process that you were so famous for within
Okay.
Lockheed.
Well, as I said, I joined Lockheed as essentially a division manager, vice president in a management role when I went to Lockheed Sanders. I was up there for a year, and then I was transferred back to Washington, D.C. A lot of that was family related. And frankly, I asked to be transferred because my wife was really struggling. She has seasonal affective disorder, and which means she has to have a lot of sunshine. And there's not a whole lot of sunshine in New Hampshire in the wintertime. So I asked and was transferred back to Washington to head up the ASW Systems demonstration facility there. And then we began the process of merging. So during my time at Lockheed, I obviously witnessed and experienced multiple episodes of change. The first one was when I moved from this little company, which actually doubled in size over the time I was there, but it was still only about 300 employees at the time. And then I moved into Sanders, which was a few thousand. And then I moved into Lockheed, which was many thousands. And so, populated by thousands of people all over the world. And that then in 1995, even that eclipsed because we then merged Lockheed and Martin Marietta into Lockheed Martin, which then formed at that time the largest aerospace and defense company in the world at that point in time, particularly in the area of aerospace and defense work. There are obviously larger companies, but not in that particular field. And this company, obviously, it came with a lot of pieces because my roles and titles changed every time we reorganized. I got a new job, and but the most challenging job I had through that time was after Lockheed and Martin merged, and then we bought L3Com. L3Com was at that time a holding company. They had bought up a whole bunch of pieces of larger companies and brought them into something called L3Com. And there were about 15 parts to that company. And they had come from other companies like GE, IBM, places like that. That they had gotten their divisions, aerospace and defense divisions. And we brought them together into what was Lockheed Martin. And I remember we were out in Arizona on an executive week, and our chairman at the time gave us all T-shirts. And the T-shirts said on them, "One company, one team." So we kind of got the message that Vance Kaufman wanted us to be Lockheed Martin, not all these other pieces.
Right.
Well, my responsibility, I was in the Washington operations group at the time. My responsibility was to bring 15 pieces together into one Lockheed Martin electronics focus at that time. And what I did, everybody was doing product oriented. This guy had a torpedo and this guy had a missile, and I said, okay, we're not going to do, because they were competing with one another for the same customer. And so I said, we're not going to do that kind of organization. We're going to organize around customers. So we then had air systems, land systems, submarine systems, and then essentially the Coast Guard federal systems. And I said, you will work together to sell all of our products to that customer. And if you don't, see ya. And we lost a couple who couldn't abide by that. But nonetheless, it worked. And so as a result of that, I then moved from the Washington operations, which was really focused on the Pentagon, focused on Congress, and with a little bit of a contact into the internet or into the domestic business development field. I was brought over to corporate headquarters and said, okay, let's put together a business development community for this team, and following the same procedures, working together, sort of set of common goals, rather than competing against one another as they had formerly incentivized to do. So what I did is I had been in places where I got top-down dictate. Those don't work well. And so what we did is we did a bottom-up build. And what I did is I formed a group from each of the companies, their lead business development. And I said, okay, bring me your best practices. Let's put them together. Let's put the best practices of all these pieces together and come up with Lockheed Martin's best practices that we will then implement across the entire corporation. And that model, that leadership and performance model, was based on something called full spectrum leadership. And that's what I expected myself and these to do. And there were 5 imperatives of full spectrum leadership. One is shape the future. One is, I'll send you this information, okay? The other one is build relationships, effective relationships. And then as a leader, energize your team, work with your team. And, oh, by the way, deliver some results. That would be nice. And along the way, I want you to personally model excellence, integrity, and accountability. And that was not just my idea. That was a corporate-wide, full-spectrum leadership. How do we bring this together? How do we incentivize and measure our leaders? So my team and I then took these imperatives, and we wanted to build this effective corporate-wide business development operation. And in order to build on the best practices of more than 20 companies now, we began this bottom-up practices review. We would meet for a week at a time and put this stuff together and talk about what we did right, what we did wrong in these various companies. And as I said, the goal was to develop a corporate level framework with a set of process standards and metrics, which all the businesses would be held accountable for. And thankfully, I had my boss and his boss behind me, because these became part of their personal metrics, their performance goals. It was cash in the pocket if you did it right. And the result was this thing we called Integrated New Business Framework. And this framework was developed. It was a 3-phase process because, as I said, you start with shape the future. Well, who shapes the future? You shape the future working with your strategic planning group. Okay. And then you build relationships. And so what we had is this 3-phase process. There was a strategic piece, a tactical piece, and an operational piece built into this. And the strategic piece in the initial phase of the framework we call that preparing for future new business. And the focus in this are the strategies and strategic activities that take place before there's an opportunity. How do you position yourself? Okay, before there's an identified opportunity. And the goal there is you try to understand what your customer values, what they need, based on exploring their unmet needs as they define them or as you find them out. And then you work with them and vision together with them for what do you need to do your job? And that's called, as I said, preparing for future new business. Well, once you get that done, you've got a good relationship now with a customer who needs what you think you can deliver. You go to the tactical phase. The tactical phase is this thing called capturing identifiable new business. So it's the business capture, if you will. And in this phase, we focus on winning the right supply of valued solutions by responding to their requests for those solutions. Of course, hopefully we've shaped them. That's the whole point, to favor our competitives, our competencies, our abilities through this phase 1 interaction with the customer. And so once you win that program, now you've got to do it. Okay. So the operational phase is the 3rd phase of this program, is called extending current business. And it's the most important because it sets you up then for continuing with this customer for the future and follow on business. And so during this phase, the key to success is flawless operational execution that delivers value to that customer. And in turn, then you get the growth, the extension, and the essentially recompetes that you win. And it develops then, as you know how important past performance is, and when they're deciding who's going to win, you've developed that past performance for innovation execution. And what I found there is these integrated teams. I put business development personnel in the strategic planning division to help them understand where that internal research and development was going to go. Why are you doing this? Who wants it? And of course, the business development, the capture part was populated by business development professionals. And of course, we had to use engineers to help us devise the solutions. And then the final part, I actually had business development people working with our program managers to position them for the follow-on, to incentivize the customer. Gee, don't you want me to do this for another 5 years? Sole source, and that was the whole. So we essentially, it was across the entire spectrum of strategic planners, program performers, and business development professionals. And that's the thing we won 3 awards for. Each one of those won an award as we rolled them out. And that the result of that. And the thing about it, as I said, that process became corporate level required processes. And when we won, we had lessons learned. Win or lose, we would send a team in and do a lessons learned. Why did you win, or why did you lose? And if you lost because you had not followed the process, there was a reckoning, if you will, at the top of senior vice president level. So needless to say, I usually got good cooperation because I had the backing of the president and chairman and the senior vice president of business development. So that's the nice thing about it. If you've got somebody, covering your back, you can get some stuff done. But anyway, the success of that was heavily dependent on working as a team. As I said, the reason we could work effectively as a team was because we exercised full spectrum leadership across that team. And that was ultimately, those elements allowed us to accomplish that goal: one company, one team.
That sounds so logical, but at the time, so many of these business development teams were focused on capturing the business and moving on to the next opportunity. And it was really one of the first times that I had seen a large organization who said, we are going to incorporate our execution and delivery and past performance into our business development process. It is the key. And even now, we work with so many of our clients still who have failed to link your delivery to the business development life cycle, and they forget that is your story. That is the basis for you winning new work, growing the existing workload. And it was working with you and your team it was the first time that I had seen this. It in most of the organizations where we worked, that was so foreign. It was this concept of we're going to kill this, move on to the next hunt. And I loved that you had galvanized the organization with this concept of this is the business. When I first started working with you, you may remember we had 15 or more contracts with Mission and Fire Control, with Aero Group, and the training organization down in Orlando. We were working a 10, which you were very involved with, and there were a lot of amazing individuals that came out of out of that Owego group. Mm-hmm. Including many of those individuals went on to become executives in the organization. You said, it doesn't make any sense. We're going to build a master services agreement at the corporation. And we started working at Bethesda under this framework that you had set up. And I remember you explaining to our team, this is how the organization is structured. This is our expectations, and this is how you're going to work within each of the business units. And those were some fun times. I mean, I could remember looking at the corporate pipeline of strategic opportunities and having you give guidance to our team, to me and personally, and to our team on this is our expectations. Now that you've talked about this framework and the overall strategy that you had put together for Lockheed, would you talk about first, if you were pursuing a large strategic opportunity, what guidance would you give to the team on the relationship and cultivating, engaging the customer on their needs? I heard you do this several times, and I thought it was exceptional. You talked a bit about preparing for capture and then the capture itself. Would you just elaborate on that, thinking about some of the major opportunities that we pursued with the organization and how you would go about guiding the team on preparing for the capture and then the capture work itself, particularly the relationship with the customer?
Well, one thing, I think the key to success was integrating across functions, if you will. I was responsible for setting up and delivering the training for this program, for how do you do this? Okay, and we had a series of institutes, we call them business development leadership institutes, if you will. And one was about capture, and one was about preparing, and I brought in engineers and program managers and taught them how to do business development and what role they played and why it was important. Same thing with strategists, the people who were doing the corporate strategy, the people who were formulating internal research and development. I brought them in, and essentially we would spend time with them, training them, and why is what you're doing important? And it's not. I know it's fun. You're technologists. You love to do this stuff, but it's not worth doing if the customer doesn't need it, doesn't want it, or doesn't understand what you're doing. And so that's all part of it. So I was looking across this framework, and as I said, you've got a strategic, tactical, and operational side. One of the things I did, I think you're aware of, and some of the people you've talked about went through this, was something called executive development and growth enhancement. What we did is we would identify young, upcoming, either business developments or aspiring to be business development professionals, typically 5-6 years into their careers. And we would select 10 a year across the corporation. It was competitive. And I would put them in a 2-year program. And the 2-year program that they were in was essentially to learn all of the aspects you talked about, the strategic, the tactical, and the operational. And so, and I did that by rotation. And this is actually a good model to do for young professionals who are developing, who you want to develop, or even old professionals you want to develop into effective business development people. And so I would bring them in for a year, 2 years, 6 months assignments. They had 4 assignments, 1 month or 1 6-month assignment at headquarters. You're going to learn how this place functions, if you will, as best you can. And so they were integrally, they essentially were on my team at corporate level. Then I would send them to Washington operations to learn how you interface with the Pentagon and interface with Congress, the high level decision makers. Then we would send them for 6 months to a field operation, day-to-day, face-to-face customer relationships. You go see the customer, whether they're mad or happy, you're going to go see them virtually every day. And so you learn how to handle both sides of that. And then the fourth one was I would send them to a company other than their own as an integrated part of their business development team at that company, so they could learn how another company did, if you will, the same thing, but in a different arena, different set of customers, different set of products. And that was essentially my executive development growth enhancement 2-year plan. And as I said, this whole preparing for future new business was a combination, for example, working with the senior vice president for strategy at the time and his really high-tech guys. We had many, many millions of dollars going into internal research and development. And the point was, unfortunately, I sat on the council, if you will, to decide what we would spend our money on. And my role was we don't spend our money on necessarily things that are fun to do. We spend our money on things that are valuable, add value to our customers, that then we become uniquely capable of doing. And I'm thinking the satellite business, for example, the geosats, the communication satellites that are now up there. We invested $50 million of our money in getting the first design ready to go on that, because we knew you could see ultimately this global GPS-3, if you will, which is now everywhere, global provisioning satellite. That was a huge competition, which we won eventually. But we won it because we spent a lot of time with the customer, understanding what they needed, and they understood what we could deliver or not, if you will. And we spent a lot of money also, but it was worth it because it became a multi-$100 billion kind of a opportunity. So the key then for strategic planning was to engage directly with the customer and understand their needs. And what I usually did, I operated, at least in my mind, 2 levels above my direct customer, because my goal was to make my direct customer successful. And in order to do that, I wanted his boss and his boss's boss to think this guy could walk on water. Okay. And so we actually studied the strategic plans of organizations at 2 levels above the customer so that our customers were responsive to their boss and their boss's boss. And ultimately, we lost customers that way because they got promoted. But the nice thing about that is now they're the second tier customer.
Right.
So you keep building it. And so that's really what it was all about is how can we make our customers successful? And then we go from there. Then we get the opportunity to do so because they release a request for proposal or a request for quote or whatever, or an RFI, request for information. And we can respond to that because I wouldn't say we wrote it, but we might have given them the notes that they used to write it. But that was,
we did a lot of that.
yeah, there's a lot of that. And then ultimately, as I said, and then as you said, the key, I don't know how many times I've seen companies lose based on past performance. They'll do wonderful idea, they have great relationships with their customer, but they didn't execute the last thing. And that's where the training of your program management and engineers in the essentials, the basic elements of business development, customer relations, customer interaction, customer value was very important because then they went into to do the work that we won with that idea of looking forward. Because what we want is, you got a 2-year with a 3-year follow-on maybe. So you want to do everything in that 2 years to make sure that 3-year follow-on becomes real. Or there's going to be a recompete in 5 years, for example. So that was the kind of thing. So the idea there was that framework, and we had titles for some of these things. For example, the strategic piece of it, we called them pathfinders. They're the guys out there finding their way through the woods, if you will. And then we get the opportunity when we had what we called hunters. These are the guys, okay, I know where there's a game out, there's a deer out there somewhere. I've got to go find it. I've got to capture it. And then the last group, essentially, we call them the skinners. So you've got the pathfinders, the hunters, and the skinners. And essentially, okay, I now have the deer, but I have to eat it. And in order to eat it, I'm going to have to skin it and turn it into steaks and stuff like that. But just really simple, concepts like that. Because I found, for example, writing proposals, many of the evaluators do not have the technical expertise that your writers have.
That's right.
Okay, so what you have to do is dumb it down, if you will, to something they can understand. Make sure they understand what you're going to do for them. Now, their engineers later on can talk to your engineers. That's fine. But in the meantime, that evaluation team is not necessarily the team that's going to execute. They're going to evaluate you. So they have to understand very clearly what you're proposing. And so that way, when I was working my master's degree, my professor at the time was what's called a descriptive physical oceanography. This lady, this is frankly, we didn't even have computers. We were doing stuff I did it on a calculator. I wrote my master's thesis on a calculator. And she was technophobic, I think. But anyway, she told me that before I started writing, I needed to learn how to write clearly, descriptively. So my assignment for 6 months was to read everything I could by Ernest Hemingway. And if you've ever read Ernest Hemingway, he's a wonderful writer and terribly descriptive, and you understand fully what he's talking about.
That's
right.
I
became an Ernest Hemingway writer. My granddaughter's doing that, by the way. Now I've got her reading Ernest Hemingway. But the whole idea there was to be able to describe in layman's terms something that's very complex. And then I get it. Okay, I know what these guys are doing. And that was really it. So there's a lot of pieces to, as I said, preparing your team. But the front end, and of course, we also, fortunately, I spent a fair amount of time in the field working with our field offices, the guys who were in the front lines, at an Air Force base, a naval base, wherever they were, and making sure they were trained in business development. So they knew what ultimately we were going to have to do once they got that customer on our side.
One of the things that I really admired about your work, Burley, is that you encourage the team to pursue new customers where we could take the products or services within an existing organization in and help other organizations. And I saw you penetrate a lot of the Fed Civ organizations that Lockheed previously had not even considered as customers. And when you would go in there, I admired so much of the process that you just talked about in helping your customer look good, helping them achieve success, and helping them achieve their personal objectives. And that's really how Lockheed started penetrating some of these other organizations that weren't even on the radar prior to you taking this position.
Yeah, moving into the area, the civil area was new, and then of course communications was emerging at the time. That's why. So go to our space company. You know, they had all kinds of wonderful satellites, most of which were highly classified. But the whole idea of satellite communications was coming into being. Well, that's a different group of people who buy communication satellites than people who buy spy satellites. So we've got to go in and educate them about the potential for satellite communications. And ultimately, like I said, GPS-free, satellite navigation. Well, what's that? Well, we were fortunate. I'll kind of a quick story on that one. It's one of those trying to energize the team, if you will. So we were in competition for GPS-3, the first one.
I remember this.
And so we had a 50-50 DARPA, a Defense Advanced Research Projects, was the initial customer on that. And so we were developing the technology for a GPS, a global positioning satellite. And we had a 50-50. We had invested several $1 million in our piece to match their piece. And we had a major competitor in there. It was Hughes at the time, which actually ended up getting bought out. But
that's right.
So I went to the West Coast, went to Sunnyvale to meet with our GPS-3 team. And once again, we were going to give them a day of training because they were getting ready to do their second phase proposal. And I went there, one of my guys and I showed up for the training. Nobody came to the office. Okay, so I walked down the hall to the vice president in charge of that business and asked him why was nobody there. He says, well, we don't need that. He says, we're engineers, we know what we're doing. I said, well, tomorrow you have a meeting with Bob Trice, who was the senior vice president for business development, at an offsite in San Diego. Either I have a room full of your engineers within an hour, or you will have a discussion with Bob Trice tomorrow about why I don't. Well, needless to say, my room filled up very quickly, and we won. We won the down select for GPS-3. But it was the point you were making earlier. They were worried about the technology. They were doing their thing, but that wasn't what it was all about. It was that positioning piece, because we were getting ready for phase 2 down select. Phase 3 was the multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. And they were so busy in the back room playing with their electronics that they forgot there's a customer out there who may or may not understand what the heck you're doing. So the night, that was, like I said, once again, it was a very nice thing about your seniors having your back. I could make a statement like that, knowing full well that when I called Bob Trice, he would do what I had just said. He was fully supportive of that. And that rattled all through the system, for example. And it was particularly true when we did lessons learned, especially when you lost. When a company lost a major program, we would do a lessons learned and try to understand why they lost. And and we were very straightforward. It wasn't a finger pointing kind of an exercise. It was very, here's what happened, here's what happened, here's what you didn't do. And that's why you lost, if you will. And once again, my boss had taken a trip to Europe, and we had just lost probably a $50-60 million startup program. And we had done the lessons learned, and a The reason we had lost was because of a decision that had been made by a senior vice president. So I was quote, asked to go do the lessons learned briefing to the chairman and the board. And I walked in the room and I told them what had happened. And he says, "Why did we lose?" I said, "Well, candidly, sir, it's because the president of this company there were two companies involved. The president of this company did not fund the research needed by the other half of his team to position them to be able to win that. And it was a communications program to win that." And he looked at the president of the company who was in the room and he said, "Why didn't you give them the money?" And it was one of those, and then so he chastised him there, you know. So then he said to me, he says, "Thank you for your candor." This is the CEO. He says, "Thank you for your candor, but I don't ever want to have another meeting like this." And I said, "Neither do I, sir." He says, "How could we make sure that's true?" I said, "If you will make our business development best practices corporate policy and hold these senior executives to it, we won't have this meeting again." He looked at me, turned to his number two guy, and he said, "Make that happen." So my policy that we had developed became corporate policy, and senior executives' bonuses were now dependent upon execution of it, including mine. But so that's the way it had to happen. It was a bottom-up build, but a top-down accountability.
I love that you, throughout your career, were so focused on mentoring and building executives. And there were all of these disciples that you had trained over the years that went on to do amazing things. I mean, Barbara Humpton, who I just admire so much, and Judy Marks and Pat Dewar, and some of these disciples that you brought in and trained. And the other thing that I think was incredible is before you had responsibility for the organization, there were very few women in leadership roles in the company, let alone in business development. And you brought so many amazing individuals in, and they went on to do incredible things. One of the challenges that I see today, Burley, is that there's a reluctance to pursue business development as a career. I think a lot of young executives see this as high pressure, and that there is you talked about results previously, and that there is accountability in this position. You know every day there's a scorecard every day of, did I win? Did I not? How am I doing against my metrics? And so I see a lot of young individuals that are not committed to this science of business development. You built an army of business development executives that this was their career. This was their path. What advice do you have for some of these young executives that are either in business development roles or considering business development roles? You did this for so long, and you were so successful in the retention of these individuals. It was their career. How do we replicate that?
Well, that was on the female side. I obviously am married to a wife she was a flight attendant with United Airlines, so she's a good-looking chick. And but I have two daughters and two sisters, so I'm the guy. Okay, so I always grew up, honestly, with a desire to support them. I'll give you an example of how that pays off. I had a secretary who worked for me in Mississippi, a young African-American woman, very, very bright. She was going to college but struggling to get support from the organization to do so. So I went to the head of human resources and asked him if he would help me get her through college. And we did. She only had a couple of years to go. So she ended up getting a bachelor's degree in college there in Mississippi. You can imagine a Black woman in Mississippi. Well, she then had the opportunity to go to the Office of Naval Research as an assistant program manager. And I backed her up on that. I wrote her up. She got the job. She funded my PhD research.
Oh my
I
goodness.
mean, who could imagine? I have another very similar situation. My secretary at Lockheed was in the same situation. She was about halfway through her degree. Once again, African-American female in Maryland now. And the Human Resources Department decided they were going to curtail undergraduate support. Once again, I went to Human Resources and he said, well, I don't have the funds. I said, I'll pay for it, but I need your backing. So he said, okay. So I paid for it out of my budget. She got her degree. She now heads up leadership development training for the corporation. And needless to say, she was a key person in our training. She was the one who really organized it and made it happen when we were training our business development people. But she took that, then took it on all the way to the corporate level. And now she's responsible for the Lockheed Martin Institutes. So those are, and we still keep in touch. She's a wonderful young lady. So that's the kind of really neat stuff that happens. But in terms of a career advice for somebody who's starting in the field or in the field, I think the talents, remember those, I talked about those 5 imperatives, those 5 full spectrum leadership imperatives. Once again, shape the future, build effective relationships, energize your team, bring them on board, okay, deliver results, and then do it with a model of excellence, integrity, and accountability. Those 5 things, live your professional life, actually live your whole life that way, but put those together. And so this then says that you need to actively seek out opportunities to interact and learn from professionals, both inside and outside of your company. So you develop teams inside the company, but you also develop teams outside the company, even with competitors, and who seek to shape the future, pursue growth opportunities, and deliver these results. And so I've found that the development of networks and relationships and teams and being an integral part of that, essentially across the spectrum of the people, customer teams, even competitors. I'll give you a case of a competitor. I was on a business trip, one of these conferences, if you will, and I'm sitting in the lounge, and this man from Northrop Grumman comes in, and we're sitting there, we're chatting, and he says, gets to know. He says, "What's your job at Lockheed?" And I told him, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you're the SOB who just, using another expletive, our rear ends on this program." I said, "Well, not directly, but yes." He said, "Let me buy you a drink." But that kind, because it was a friendly competition, if you will. He knows we had done everything we could. They did everything they could, and they lost in that time. They won probably the next time. But the whole idea was develop those relationships. As I've told people, I have never had to look for a job. It's always come looking for me. And that's because of relationships. And, over time, kind of across the board, so that's the nice thing about it. So one of the goals that's in that strategic plan that we built in 2012 was to develop the next generation of LSI leaders. I remember that specific.
That's right.
And so I would say members of your community, particularly your new business community, they need to go find the boss. Find out what their role is in his or her plan, and then do it. So those. I'll give you another example of my boss. One of the things we did was, particularly with your direct report boss, you would grade yourself, and then he would grade you. And then you would come together for about an hour conference and compare your grades. And in this one in particular time with my boss, we came in and compared the grades, and he, generally I had done very well. But there was one area that he said I was less than a 10. Okay. And it was an area that he said was I spent a lot of time with my family and on vacation. And I said, so have I ever missed a deadline? No. Have I ever not delivered what you expected? No. I said, it's called balancing work and family. Do you object to that? He said, no, I'll change your score. And that's the other thing is life balance. Life balance. You do what you have to do at the work, but leave some time for yourself and your family.
That's such great advice. I admire so much about you. I know that your family is all important to you, and your faith as well. And I've always admired that about you, working for you at Lockheed and then a member of our team. Burley, one of the things that I also always admired about you is that you were one of the best proposal development executives that I ever had an opportunity to work with. And I think the reason that you were so good at this discipline is that you saw it as a tool. It was necessary to win the business. It was a necessary step to win the business, but that because you did that work up front, because you had the team focused on preparing to win, visualizing what the future looks like, and building this relationship. When you entered into that proposal phase, there was never a time that you weren't prepared to tell this story. And I could sense this confidence, this passion for the business, and that you approach these proposals knowing that had done everything up to that point to win this business. You just needed to tell the story now. Can you think, or give me some examples of some of these large proposals that you either contributed to? I know you did a lot of the strategy on some of these key proposals yourself. You would go in there and work proposal strategy oftentimes with the team. But I mean, talk just for a minute about the proposal development phase of this, because I also see a lot of organizations that do not do the work up front. They're not prepared going into this proposal phase, and they're writing horrible stories.
One of the things we did this at Lockheed Martin, but when I was working with other companies, if you remember when I was with you, there were about 3 companies that we were supporting. One of them was United Space Alliance. Remember that? They were the human space flight experts at the time, as we were transitioning out of space shuttle. Cobham, another company we worked with, and then Arctic Slope, which I believe you're still very well connected with.
We are.
But those 3 companies, and they did not have good capture processes. And so what we developed, which was kind of a derivative of our process, is something what I call the capture management life cycle. And it's really a 4-phase life cycle. And the first phase is identification and assessment of an opportunity. It's, you look at your market. This, like you said, this is the very early on piece. You look at your market, you identify opportunities, you validate, is this real or not? Are they really going to do it? And then you've got lots of opportunities out there. Which ones are the most important in the series that I'm best positioned for? So then you've identified now a set. This is really kind of your pipeline, your potential pipeline. Okay. So you do that, and then you pick the ones that you're going to go after based on this assessment that you've done, the assessment of this opportunities. And the key step there, and this sometimes doesn't happen, right, is you put somebody in charge of it. You assign the capture manager early. Now that capture manager then is responsible, maybe the RFP is not out yet, to then make some customer contact, develop that win strategy, and develop that plan step by step by step by step. How are we going to deliver this proposal? And then what's the answer? What's the conceptual solution? So you haven't seen the RFP yet, but you kind of know what that customer wants. You talk to them, so you develop a conceptual solution. Okay, then it hits. You get one. No, so the opportunity actually shows up, and maybe it's a sources sought or something like that. But then you populate that team. You've got your capture manager. You populate the team. You start doing your capture plan that you've built. You take that win strategy and fill it out, detail it. You put the solution together, get your engineers. You had a conceptual solution. What's the real one? What are we going to propose here? And then you've got the whole idea of how are you going to manage this? You put somebody in charge of just the nuts and bolts of scheduling of the proposal management. How do I manage this proposal? Put your proposal team out. You got writers, you got all kinds of different people, artists, editors, whatever. Oh, so by the way, I'm going to have to cost this thing. So what's my cost plan look like? What is it going to cost, and what do I have to bid to win? Okay. And then you get a draft RFP from the customer and you go with that. Okay. So then you do the cost pricing back and forth, price to win, if you will, PTW, remember that. And then you take that initial, write the executive summary before you write the proposal. So that's the short version, if you will. And then put a team on that to analyze that executive summary. Does this make any sense? And we call that the pink team. So remember all those different colored teams we went to. And so we do that and go forward from there. And then you actually put the proposal together. So that's phase 4, is the proposal delivery. And you do a kickoff, you look at your draft RFP, you do all your various reviews, then you deliver that proposal responsively to that customer. And then you win, well, hopefully. But then the key is you don't stop there. Now, okay, so I've won this program. So now I need to go make sure I'm in the briefing when the customer debriefs that award, so I could pick up maybe some weaknesses or some intelligence on the competitor for the next round. So hand it off to the execution team, and then, as we said, develop it. But then now go back and look at that whole process again and do what we call the lessons learned. What did I do right? What did I do wrong? What would I do differently if I had the opportunity to do this over again? Win or lose, but typically you want to be obviously being able to do that when you're winning. So what I developed and actually trained companies to was this 4-phase detailed plan of how do you manage a capture from the initial concept all the way through the delivery and post-award.
I think this is so relevant, especially now that many of these organizations have said we're going to limit the page limit of a proposal to 30 pages. The turnaround time may be 10 days or less, 5 days or so. Having that preparation, doing the capture work is so critical. It's become even more important, having the relationship on site, being prepared, having the text written. I mean, we're giving a lot of our clients advice. You need to have the proposal written prior to the RFP coming out, because if you don't have that document developed or close to being finalized, you're going to have a difficult time developing a winning proposal in this limited time frame of 5 to 10 days. And even 30 days is a quick turnaround time. We don't have the 2 years to develop these large proposals like we used to do. And it's got to be very concise. You've got to tell the story. You said you used to start with the executive summary. That's what a lot of these proposals have become now, is what we used to write as the executive summary.
Uh-huh.
I mean, there's a lot of other things that we could pursue, Burley, with your career and this incredible process. A couple of comments and observations that I have. we estimate that Lockheed stock went up about 300% during the time that, that you had responsibility for business development. And it wasn't just the stock, it wasn't stock value that went up, but revenue, real
Mhm.
capture in the organization that you were responsible for. And I've seen that over the last decade in our own organization, implementing a lot of the strategy that you developed for our organization and helped us implement. And I'm so appreciative of that. I saw over the years working with you a real passion for what you did, and you were having fun. I never saw a time when you weren't you weren't smiling, and even when things got tough and tense, and you always were having fun. And I this is what I'm telling these young executives is it is high pressure. There is a expectation for results. You have responsibility for building and capturing revenue for your organization, but it's fun too. There's a lot of fun in this, and remember that. Don't always be so serious with your team. That remember to have some fun along the way, and you did that well, and you said it extremely well, that it's important to have a balance in this. You can't just work 80 hours a week and never go home. That's not sustainable. It's not going to work. Any other advice that you have for business development executives that looking back on your illustrious career?
Well, one of the things that we did when we were developing, as part of our development of the strategy, if you remember the strategic initiatives matrix, it was a fairly complex piece of, I'll show you what it looks like. But the point there was, okay, so you have these overarching corporate goals. Now, I remember the corporate goals at the time was you wanted $100 million revenue in 2012. You wanted to reduce the overhead by 15%. You wanted to achieve compliance, ISO 9000 compliance, and establishing goals, if you will, for each employee. Those were corporate goals, and they were linked. Then we had to link them with the overarching strategy that we had put together. And then each of the divisions were then responsible for responding to that with their own set of objectives. And then we had what was called division tactics, which is, okay, you've got these objectives. How are you going to deliver them? And who's responsible? And I thought that matrix, which we adapted at that time, was like on one piece of paper for each of my functional organizations. We now have an accountability statement.
That's right.
That ties in with what we do as a corporation and what we want to do long term with this company. And I thought that's the first time I'd ever done that. And I'm looking at the one. This was the one for consulting business unit. I've got a copy of that one. It's very detailed and lots of dots. And because there was a very detailed set of tactics to deliver to what we had laid out in terms of strategic corporate level goals and objectives. And I think that was set it down and write it down, and then how we do it. And so the accountability piece was there. As I said, I remember the strategic goals we had when I was there was, one was we're going to drive growth across all the businesses, okay, all the lines of business. We wanted LSI to become a prime logistics company. We wanted LSI to be recognized as a premier aerospace defense business development company, and then develop the next generation of leaders. Those were the 4 strategic level goals. And each one of them had strategies, actions, responsible individuals. Then they were mapped into this matrix. And that matrix, it was a tool. It was there to enhance your ability to track interactions across the company with the objectives, the tactics, and then assess and or modify. Yeah, this isn't happening. Why not? And I think, as I said, they began in 2012 because we were writing the 2012 plan. I have no idea how it went, but obviously it went well. because the proposed strategies were to be implemented. And like I said, I don't know to what degree they drove the success that obviously over the last 10 years you've experienced. I know you've done, I know there was a SM&A piece in there. There's a whole bunch of things that I've observed happening. So a lot of change, a lot of churn, if you will, but successfully, it appears. And besides that, she's got some good restaurants. And
Well, let me say, looking back now 10 years from that time that you developed the strategy and helped us implement it, it's still the core of the business. It's exactly what you did for Lockheed, you did for us. And we had a similar growth trajectory because of this strategy. And I'm so grateful for the guidance and mentoring that you gave me over the years. And as we celebrate our 50th anniversary this year, looking back, you had such a incredible impact on our company, on me personally, Burley, and I am so grateful. When I talk about who are some of my mentors in this business, your name is always on that list, and I'm so thankful for the opportunity to spend time with you and the guidance that you gave me, both as my client and then also as a member of our team. It's remarkable, and I'm so appreciative.
well, thank you for that. As I thoroughly enjoyed I guess it was 14 months or whatever, because it was a very different, obviously, environment than I'd been in for 20 years, but it was fun. And like you said, it was fun. And I liked the mix because there was the internal piece, let's develop a strategy. And then I'll just kind of in closing, the one, and I'll say disappointment, and it's not with the company, it's with the client, was when we were working with United Space Alliance. And we knew that in that administration, they were moving toward commercial space. And of course, at that time, up until that time, space, particularly manned space, was owned by Lockheed and Boeing through United Launch Alliance and United Space Alliance. Right. They owned it. So now you've got these other companies, SpaceX, for example, coming on the line. And we knew that the shuttle business, as we knew it at the time, was going to go away. So United Space Alliance was probably going to go away. And so my strategy for them, when we developed their strategy, was because these other companies, I was Blue Horizon or something like that, SpaceX, there were like 2 or 3 companies that were moving into manned spaceflight, but they had no expertise. And my proposal to United Space Alliance was to propose to be a partner with all 3 of them. And that, I believe, would have saved them. However, Boeing, who owned half of United Space Alliance, then said no, not only no, but you will not accept any extensions of current programs, nor will you be allowed to bid on any new ones, which was the death of United Space Alliance, which is interesting because the people I worked with at United Space Alliance, virtually all of them went to the commercial companies.
Right, exactly. I remember.
And now look at who's launching the next set of trips up to the space. It's not Boeing.
No.
And they still get to do the rockets, perhaps, but manned spaceflight is now not owned by United Space Alliance. It's now owned by these other companies. So that's one of those. That was they didn't listen.
That's right. And interestingly, I'm going to Vandenberg Air Force Base in a few weeks, and we're having this exact discussion about some of these other companies that you'd mentioned taking over operations and execution of space flight. Burley, this has been so great to catch up with you, and thank you for doing this. I just want to tell one last story and have you comment. A few weeks ago, I had somebody say to me, what is one of your most memorable sporting events that you've ever been to. And we were talking about how COVID's changed sports. And without hesitation, I said, there was a time that I got to attend an Army-Navy game at FedEx Field, and it was the final game of the season. It was 7 degrees and snowing and his terrible weather. And I attended that game with you and Chip. And Chip was rooting for Army. You were rooting for Navy. And if you remember, we were sitting a few seats away from President Obama and Leon Panetta and John Kerry and Joe Biden and I think the entire Obama cabinet was at that game, sitting on either side of us in FedEx Field on that such a cold day. It was one of the most memorable sporting events of my life, and I've been to a lot of sporting events, but to be there with you that day and see those kids in formation, the Navy and Army kids on the field was so memorable. And I think about that a lot. That was really a special day that we spent together, and I appreciate you taking me to that game.
Well, we obviously enjoyed it ourselves. I particularly enjoyed the dinner that you took us to. And I would say, say hello to your lovely wife. And,
I will, and you as well.
I will.
I think so highly.
We had fun. Like I say, and you hit it a while ago. You got to have a combination of work and play. And if you're doing enough playing, then the work's not that bad. And you can even play at work as long as it's focused.
You're amazing. Well, I look forward to catching up with you. I'm in Washington next. We'll make that happen. And thanks again for doing this. This was incredible. You're an amazing individual. Thank you, Burley.
Thank you.